So today we want to talk a little bit about link building. And before I go into the details and the specifics of link building, I think it's important to define the terms here. So what exactly is link building? Link building, as the name somewhat implies, is building a link to your primary site. There's a bunch of ways you can build links to your primary site, but first you might ask why this is important. And essentially, the primary reason why this is important is that the rationale behind link building is that if your site is important enough that, for example, your content is good, you have a particular article that's interesting, somebody is going to link to your site because it has informative information or it's unique in some way. Back in the past, people would just artificially create a bunch of links to their site, and Google would just rank sites based on the number of links they had pointing to their website. And so by building a ton of links to your website, you would be able to increase the number of backlinks you had and essentially superinflate the value of your site artificially. Nowadays it's not that easy, but link building still has its very primary and practical purpose that will never fully be rid of because of the fact that link building is a natural phenomenon. Okay, let's go ahead and just start graphically representing what a backlink looks like. So let's imagine that this rectangle right here represents, schematically speaking, your main site. A backlink would consist of, let's say that this circle right here is some random site. A backlink would consist of that site having a URL representation of your main site somewhere on its page. And so now it's pointing at your main site. You can imagine if you want that main site to have more backlinks, you would just have more individual sites that are pointing to your main site. Now the problem is, as I stated earlier, that Google kind of frowns upon this because the number of backlinks is no longer directly correlates to the importance of your website. So CEOs have come up with this new idea called the juice transfer of links. And essentially what this means is how much juice does one particular link, or how much value does one particular link have. And to represent this, let's just go ahead and draw a different representation. Let's imagine, once again, we have a site with a backlink to our main site. Let's call this link 1. Now let's imagine we have another site, right? But instead of pointing to your main site this time, this site is now pointing to the separate site that's creating the backlink to your main site. So it's an indirect link, if you will, and we can call that link 2. Now what happens is, because now your link 1 is valued a little bit higher in the eyes of Google because somebody else is referencing it, you're creating a chain of links that passing juice. So the juice transfer of links is essentially when you have a link that is pointing to your main site that has a lot of value. And to create value, instead of spamming your site with a bunch of links, you spam the site that is pointing to your main site. So you create artificial value with outside of an abstracted layer per se. So now you can kind of imagine here a scenario where you might be able to expand this a little further, right? So let's say we have our main site, right? And instead of just having a bunch of chains of link juices flowing, let's create a site that we call a buffer site, right? And this buffer site is going to be the location from which we spam a bunch of link juice to. And so this buffer site is going to have a ton of link juice because essentially what's going to end up happening is we have a bunch of sites that are backlinking to this buffer site. And so this buffer site is going to have a lot of link juice value. And instead of having all these sites reference your main site, all you need to create is one link from your buffer site to your main site. And this buffer site is going to pass all the juice from those many backlinks that are referencing it to your main site. And so now you might be asking, okay, what could be a buffer site? Well, before I do that, let's first talk about just a little bit of schematics here, a labeling scheme here that you might hear a lot. And I just want to go ahead and just mention it now so we'll spare the confusion later. We call the main site Tier 1. And essentially this means that this site is the highest tier level, right? This is the main site, or our niche site. This is a site that we want to have the most juice pathing to. So it's called tier 1. The buffer site is called tier 2, and it's essentially the second site in the schematic leveling system, if you can imagine that. And then, of course, all the sites that are referencing to your buffer site are called tier 3. And then you can imagine tier 4s, tier 5s, and so on. And they would just be referencing the tier 3 links. And so now, let's go and talk about what a buffer site is. So essentially, a buffer site is... A buffer site are essentially Web 2.0s. And a Web 2.0 is just a fancy way of saying, new age websites. These are websites that no longer have just static HTML pages on them. They're websites like WordPress, Blogger, Easy an Article, Twitter, social platforms such as Twitter, Facebook. All these websites have a bunch of value, and they've been around for a while, and users can create accounts on them. And by being able to create accounts on these websites, you can essentially add content to it. So for example, if you created a free blog on Blogger, or Blogspot, you could put content on your website and then add a link. For example, your niche site is PC gaming. You could create a website on Blogger or a blog that talks about gaming. And then you say, if you want to learn more about gaming, go to www.pcgaming.com. And you just effectively created a backlink to your own website. And then if you want your blog to have more link juice, what you need to do is you need to go and spam a bunch of backlinks to that blog. And so this way you're providing a security blanket or a security layer between your main site and all the spam you're about to basically backlink to your site. And so essentially what this all boils down to is you're creating what is called a link pyramid. And let me try to graphically draw here, if I can draw a pyramid. What's kind of going on here? You imagine a pyramid as a top-down infrastructure, right? And at the very top, right here, you can imagine your main site. And we would want all the link juice to flow up to your main site, right? So you can imagine the level just below your main site to be tier 2 links, right? These are all the buffer sites. Now remember, you can have more than one buffer site, hence the pyramid structure, right? You can imagine we have another buffer site, so it would be a tier 2 here. And then you have tier 3 links, right, that are referencing to your tier 1 or your tier 2 buffer site. And you can have tier 4 links, you can have tier 5 links. And you can kind of see this kind of pyramid scheme that's building up. So you have all these links that are pointing up and adding link juice that ultimately ends up to your main site. And you can imagine each face of a pyramid, or you can have more than 4 faces to your pyramid, can be a specific buffer site in mind. So for example, let's say you wanted to create a WordPress blog. Well, this would be your WordPress face to the pyramid. Or let's say you want your tier 2 buffer site to be your Twitter account, or your Facebook account, or your YouTube account. The possibilities are endless here. You can create as many different buffer sites you want pointing your website, but remember that the goal here is not to spam your main site, but to essentially add value to it, and you add value through link juicing. So hopefully this gives you a brief introduction into the ideas of link building and clears up any confusions you might have on any of the terms. Look at the article below, and I'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to go through and manually do all these different processes.